I felt the words rise in me the way a cough rises in a silent room. Sudden, urgent, impossible to hide. They sat behind my teeth and pressed against my tongue until my jaw ached. I kept swallowing as if I could push them back down into my stomach, bury them where fear could digest them into something harmless. But they weren't harmless. That was the problem. They were sharp. They were heavy. They had edges. It wasn't bravery that brought them up. It was something uglier, more practical. A recognition, a small alignment of details that didn't belong together. A pause too long. A phrase that sounded clean but didn't fit what I'd just seen. A certainty spoken with the kind of ease that only comes from not being the one who will pay for it. The room, whatever it was, felt too warm. Or maybe my skin was too tight. I remember the sensation of my shirt clinging at my shoulders, the dampness at the base of my spine. I remember the smell that lives in places where people wait for something they don't name. Old fabric, metal, breath held too long. Someone laughed quietly at something small, something meant to break the tension without admitting it existed. The laughter didn't loosen anything. It only proved that everyone could feel the strain, and everyone was pretending they couldn't. I watched mouths move. I watched hands gesture toward certainty. I watched eyes slide away from the corners where doubt might be hiding, and inside me the same thought kept returning, not as a sentence but as a pressure. Say it now. Say it before it becomes too late to matter. But the moment you speak, you become visible. That is what they don't tell you, not openly, not in words you can quote. They teach it in smaller ways, through the way conversations stop when someone asks the wrong question, through the way an honest face is treated like a defect, through the way a person's future can disappear without anyone ever saying why. You learn that speech has a cost. You learn that the cost is rarely paid in dramatic ways. It is paid in coldness, in exclusion, in the sudden absence of help when you need it, in being marked as difficult, unreliable, disloyal. I could already imagine the shift in the air if I opened my mouth. The eyes would move to me, not all at once. One pair first, then another, like dogs turning their heads when a new sound enters the yard. There would be a short silence, the kind that feels polite on the surface and violent underneath. Someone would ask me to repeat myself, as if clarity could turn my concern into a misunderstanding. Someone would smile without warmth, the way you smile at a child who is interrupted. And then it would be decided, quietly, efficiently, that I was a problem that needed to be managed. I told myself I was being dramatic. I told myself I didn't know enough. I told myself that what I had noticed could be nothing, that it was safer to assume I was wrong than to risk being right. I listened harder. I searched their voices for hesitation, for any hint that someone else had seen what I had seen. I waited for a pause where doubt could enter like air through a crack. But the rhythm was steady, confident, unbroken. They spoke as if the future had already agreed with them. My hands were still, too still. I realized I'd been gripping something, cloth or paper or my own sleeve, so tightly my fingers had gone numb. I forced them to loosen slowly so no one would notice the tremor. I kept my face arranged the way it was supposed to be arranged. Neutral, attentive, empty. The words came again, harder now, because my mind began supplying pictures that I didn't want. Not scenes of glory or smoke or noise, just small, unbearable consequences. A door that wouldn't open, a message that wouldn't arrive in time, a name spoken out loud with the wrong kind of softness, a look exchanged between people who suddenly understood. I tried to find a compromise with myself. I could speak later. I could mention it to someone privately. I could ask a question that sounded harmless, wrapped in the right tone, softened at the edges. I could make it seem like curiosity instead of warning. I could protect myself while still doing something. But even that required the first betrayal, admitting, in some way, that I doubted what was being done. My throat tightened. I tasted something metallic, as if fear had its own flavor. My heart beat in my ears, slow and loud, like a drum someone was trying not to play. The moment for a question came and went. Someone finished speaking. Another voice followed immediately, confident enough to step on the end of the sentence. There was no space, no invitation, no opening that wouldn't be forced open with my own hands. I felt myself weigh my life in that place against the lives I could not see. I felt how quickly the mind learns to value what is near, what is immediate, what can punish you by tomorrow morning. And then without anyone telling me to, without a hand on my shoulder or a glare across the room, I let the words sink back down. I nodded along with the others, and silence was already chosen. The days had a shape to them that didn't invite interruption. They began the same way, ended the same way, and everything in between was arranged to discourage deviation. Order was not just expected, it was absorbed. It settled into the walls, into the cadence of footsteps, into the way voices lowered automatically when certain figures passed by. I was not important enough to decide anything, but I was close enough to watch decisions harden, close enough to hear how certainty was manufactured. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Authority rarely raises its voice when it knows it will be obeyed. There was a system to how things moved. Messages traveled downward, never sideways. Questions moved upward only when wrapped carefully, stripped of anything that might resemble doubt. You learned quickly which words belonged where. You learned which ones did not belong anywhere at all. Most of the time, nothing needed to be said. The expectations were already understood. You stood where you were told, you listened, you recorded, you waited. If something felt wrong, you checked yourself first. If it still felt wrong, you assumed there was something you hadn't been told yet. And if that feeling refused to go away, you learned to carry it quietly, like an injury that couldn't be seen. Those above me spoke with a confidence that felt rehearsed, but not false. It came from repetition, from having decisions accepted without resistance. They did not explain themselves because they had never been required to. When they paused, it wasn't to consider alternatives. It was to allow others to catch up. I watched how silence was rewarded, not with praise, but with continuity. You remained where you were. Your name stayed on lists. Your presence remained unremarkable, which was its own kind of safety. I watched how hesitation was treated, not as an act of conscience, but as inefficiency, a slowing of momentum, something that threatened the smooth passage of intent. There were reminders everywhere of what happened to those who disrupted that flow. They weren't announced. No one pointed them out. You noticed them the way you notice a scar on a familiar face. Someone who had once been present was suddenly elsewhere. Someone who used to speak freely now spoke carefully, or not at all. Files stopped arriving. Requests went unanswered. The machine did not break them loudly. It simply moved around them. Fear didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated. It was taught in fragments, in the way a superior's expression hardened at the wrong suggestion, in the way a room cooled when a question lingered too long, in the way people learned to look down at their hands when a decision was being explained, not because they disagreed, but because looking up felt like an accusation. I had a place in that structure, not high, not invisible. I was expected to understand enough to execute without misunderstanding, but not enough to interfere. My role required attention, not interpretation, accuracy, not judgment. I told myself that was appropriate, that it was how things had to function. The environment made it easy to confuse obedience with professionalism. You learned to take pride in precision, in doing exactly what was asked, no more, no less. You learned to feel satisfaction in being reliable. And somewhere along the way, reliability began to feel like virtue. Conversations followed predictable paths. Certain topics were safe. Certain concerns were theoretical only, discussed in abstract terms that never pointed toward immediate action. Anything that hinted at uncertainty in the present tense was redirected, postponed, or dissolved into procedure. I remember the weight of that routine more than any single moment. The repetition wore down resistance. Each day without consequence made silence feel justified. Each successful completion of a task made doubt seem unnecessary, even indulgent. When authority spoke, it did so with the expectation of agreement, not because agreement was demanded, but because it was assumed. That assumption was powerful. To break it would require more than evidence. It would require a willingness to stand apart, to accept being reclassified. I watched others navigate this with a kind of practiced care. They asked questions that confirmed decisions instead of challenging them. They framed concerns as requests for clarification, never as objections. They understood the choreography, when to speak, when to stop, when to disappear into the background. There was an unspoken rule that mattered more than any written one. Responsibility flowed upward, but consequences flowed down. Those who decided rarely stood where the outcome would land. Those who stood there learned not to interfere with decisions already in motion. I told myself that this was not cruelty, it was necessity, that large systems could not afford hesitation, that doubt was a luxury reserved for after things were finished, that my role was to trust the structure that had placed me there, and yet the closer I watched, the more I understood that the structure relied on something fragile, the willingness of people like me to remain quiet when certainty felt misplaced. It depended on the assumption that silence meant agreement, or at least insignificance. I felt the pressure of that assumption every time I entered a room where decisions were forming. It pressed against my chest, steady and familiar. I learned to breathe around it, to let it pass through me without leaving a mark on my face. By the time the routines were broken by urgency, by the sense that something irreversible was approaching, the habit of silence was already established. It felt less like a choice and more like gravity, pulling everything downward into place. The argument never happened out loud. It unfolded entirely in the narrow space behind my eyes, where no one could interrupt it, and no one could help me resolve it. It began as a simple observation, the kind you dismiss without ceremony. Something didn't align. A sequence moved too quickly. An assumption slid past without being tested. At first it felt minor, almost petty to notice. I told myself that experience above my own had already accounted for it, that whatever I was sensing had been weighed and discarded long before it reached me. But the thought refused to stay quiet. It returned at inconvenient moments, pressing in while I was meant to be listening to something else. It followed me through routines that normally required no thought at all. It surfaced when I tried to sleep, when the noise of the day finally fell away, and there was nothing left to distract me from it. I rehearsed words in my head that I never intended to use. They came out wrong every time, too blunt, too uncertain, too alarmed. I softened them, then softened them again until they barely resembled the warning I felt forming. Even then they sounded dangerous, not because of what they accused, but because of what they implied, that someone else had missed something. That certainty had cracks. I imagined speaking and watched the room turn against me in small, precise ways. No one shouted. No one needed to. A raised eyebrow would be enough. A pause just long enough to signal irritation. The discussion would continue, but now it would orbit around me, as if I were an obstacle to be navigated rather than a voice to be heard. I saw my future narrow in those imagined moments. Tasks reassigned, access reduced, trust thinned until it was ceremonial only. Not punishment, something colder than that. Correction, adjustment, the quiet reclassification of a person who required supervision. Then I imagined the other future, the one that waited if I stayed silent. It was harder to picture because it was vague, undefined. It lived in hypotheticals and maybes. It asked me to believe that inaction could carry weight, that absence could become responsibility, that by doing nothing, I was still choosing. I tried to tell myself that I was not responsible for outcomes I could not control, that my position exempted me from the burden of foresight, that I was not paid to imagine consequences beyond my narrow lane. These thoughts felt rehearsed, borrowed from others who had needed them more than I did. Still, the pressure remained. There were moments, brief, dangerous moments, when I almost spoke without deciding to, when the words surged upward before fear could restrain them. Once my mouth actually opened, I felt air move across my tongue. I stopped just short of sound, turned the motion into a cough, lowered my eyes. No one noticed. Or if they did, they chose not to. That frightened me more than open resistance would have. It meant how easily I could disappear even while standing in the same room, how little friction there was between presence and irrelevance. I began to question my own perception. I replayed what I had seen, what I had heard, searching for exaggeration. I told myself I was prone to anxiety, that stress sharpened instincts into false alarms. I reminded myself of past worries that had led nowhere, of times when trust in the system had been rewarded with outcomes that made sense only after the fact. But this felt different, not louder, quieter, more deliberate, the kind of wrongness that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. It simply waits. I watched others closely, looking for signs that they shared my hesitation. Faces remained composed. Movements were efficient. If anyone else felt it, they hid it well. That isolation fed my doubt. If this were real, surely someone else would say something. Surely I wasn't the only one to notice. The thought turned against itself. Maybe the reason no one spoke was the same reason I hadn't yet. Maybe silence didn't mean absence of concern. Maybe it meant abundance. That realization brought no comfort. It only multiplied the weight. I found myself bargaining with time. If the moment passed without incident, I would know I'd been wrong. If there was still an opportunity later, I could act then, when evidence was clearer, when urgency justified disruption. I told myself that patience was wisdom, not avoidance. But each delay made the next one easier. Each unspoken warning made the following one feel less urgent, as if the danger itself were growing accustomed to being ignored. The internal debate never resolved. It circled endlessly, feeding on fear and restraint in equal measure. And beneath it all, a quieter thought began to take shape, one I tried not to name. That soon the chance to speak would no longer exist at all. The decision arrived the way they often do, not as a declaration, but as a conclusion everyone pretended had already been reached. There was no dramatic pause, no sharp intake of breath. The words were spoken evenly, with the calm confidence of something that had been rehearsed long enough to feel inevitable. It was presented as alignment, as clarification, as the natural next step in a sequence that no one questioned, because questioning it would mean admitting the sequence itself could be wrong. I was close enough to hear it clearly, close enough to feel the shift when the room accepted it. My body reacted before my mind did. A tightening across my chest, a warmth that rushed up my neck and settled behind my ears. My hands went cold. The warning surged again, stronger now, no longer abstract. It had shape, weight, direction. It was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty asking to be acknowledged. This was it, I thought. This is the moment it still matters. I could feel the words forming, more complete now than they had ever been. They weren't perfect, but they were real. They didn't accuse, they didn't dramatize, they simply pointed. Here, this part. This doesn't hold. The silence before speech is a physical thing. It gathers, it stretches, it invites interruption. I felt it open in front of me like a door left ajar. All I had to do was push. Instead, I froze. Time slowed in a way that had nothing to do with urgency and everything to do with fear. I became aware of absurd details. The faint mark on the table where something heavy had once been dragged, the rhythm of someone's breathing beside me, the way a sleeve brushed against my arm when another person shifted their weight. These details anchored me to the moment, made it impossible to pretend it wasn't happening. I imagined the sound of my own voice breaking the room open. I imagined how foreign it would feel, rising where agreement was expected. I imagined the looks, not angry, not shocked, just measured, appraising, as if my value were being recalculated in real time. I felt the pull of every lesson I had learned about survival in that environment. Don't interrupt momentum. Don't embarrass authority. Don't introduce uncertainty when certainty has already been declared. Don't confuse concern with permission. Someone else spoke, not to challenge the decision, but to reinforce it. A small addition, a confirmation, the kind of contribution that signaled alignment without requiring thought. Heads nodded, pens moved. The machinery resumed its rhythm. The opening narrowed. I told myself that it wasn't my place, that the responsibility belonged to someone else, someone better positioned, someone whose voice carried weight. I told myself that if the concern were truly critical, it would already have been addressed. That silence here was not cowardice, but discipline. The words pressed harder, now fighting gravity. My jaw clenched. I could feel my teeth grinding slightly, the sound loud inside my own skull. I kept my eyes forward, afraid that if I looked at anyone directly, they might see what was happening and expect something of me. The decision was repeated, this time with finality. Not louder, firmer, the kind of tone that closes doors without announcing it. That was when I understood that if I spoke now, it would no longer be a warning. It would be an interruption, a disruption, a challenge to something already in motion. The cost rose sharply in that instant, and I felt myself calculate it without choosing to. My throat tightened until swallowing hurt. I forced myself to breathe evenly, slowly, the way I had learned to do when panic threatened to make itself visible. Inhale, hold, exhale. Each breath felt like an act of containment. I lowered my gaze. It was a small movement, almost nothing, but it was decisive. The words "denied release" turned inward. They didn't disappear. They settled somewhere deep, heavy, and unresolved. I felt them lodge there, a pressure that would not ease. The room moved on. Another topic. Another matter requiring attention. The transition was seamless, practiced. Whatever hesitation had existed evaporated the moment it was no longer voiced. No one looked at me. No one needed to. My silence blended perfectly with the rest. And in that moment, quiet, unremarkable, irreversible, I understood that the choice had been made, not by the one who spoke the decision aloud, but by me. I had been present. I had known, and I had said nothing. The silence didn't feel neutral. It felt sealed. What followed did not arrive all at once. There was no single moment that announced itself as consequence. It unfolded gradually, the way rot spreads beneath paint, unnoticed until the surface begins to give. At first, everything appeared to continue as planned. Movements were made. Instructions were carried out. Reports came back in the expected formats, with the expected language. On paper, nothing looked wrong. That was the most unsettling part. The structure held at least long enough to make doubt feel unreasonable. I told myself this was proof that my fear had been misplaced, that the silence I chose had spared me unnecessary trouble. That restraint had been the correct response. For a brief time, that belief almost settled. Then small irregularities began to surface. They were not dramatic, not alarming enough to halt anything already in motion. A delay that required explanation. A change in tone where there had once been confidence. A request for clarification that arrived too late to alter what had already been set in place. I recognized these signs immediately, not because they were obvious, but because they matched the shape of the warning I had swallowed. They moved in the same direction. They followed the same logic. Each one felt like a quiet confirmation, offered too gently to provoke action. I watched others respond to them with procedural calm. Adjustments were made. Language was softened. The narrative shifted just enough to preserve the appearance of control. No one acknowledged the pattern forming beneath these responses, or if they did, they treated it as coincidence, not consequence. The realization settled slowly. The danger had not been avoided. It had simply been delayed. Time stretched in a way that made responsibility feel diffuse. When the first undeniable confirmation arrived, it was already surrounded by explanations, context, conditions, variables no one could have predicted, the kind of framing that absolves without admitting error. I stood close enough to hear those explanations and feel their hollowness. They slid past the truth without touching it. Each one echoed the same unspoken premise, that what was happening now could not be traced back to a moment when it could have been prevented. But I knew better. I recognized the sequence. I could see how the initial certainty had created momentum, how momentum had resisted interruption, how resistance had turned hesitation into silence. I could trace it back to the exact instant when words might have changed the shape of what followed. That knowledge had nowhere to go. As more information arrived, it did so with increasing weight, not in the form of spectacle, but in absence. Messages that stopped coming, updates that grew vague, names that were no longer mentioned. Each omission felt deliberate, though no one admitted to making it so. The environment changed subtly. Voices lowered. Movements became more careful. The ease that had once accompanied decision-making thinned into something brittle. People spoke less freely, as if the air itself had learned to listen. I felt a growing sense of separation from those around me, not because they suspected anything, but because I was carrying something they were not, or were unwilling to acknowledge. Every development pressed against the memory of that moment, sharpening it. I did not say, "I knew," to anyone. The words would have been unbearable, even in private. They implied ownership, and ownership implied responsibility. Instead, I listened. I absorbed. I watched the consequences take shape in ways that mirrored my earliest fear with cruel precision. Sleep became difficult, not because of noise or activity, but because my mind replayed the same sequence endlessly, searching for variation. I returned to the silence again and again, examining it from every angle, hoping to find justification strong enough to dull its edge. Nothing worked. The more time passed, the clearer the pattern became. What had been treated as unforeseeable began to feel inevitable. And inevitability, I realized, is often just what we call outcomes we refuse to interrupt. I felt a quiet helplessness settle over me, heavier than fear. Fear implies the possibility of action. This did not. The moment for intervention had expired, and what remained was observation, witnessing the confirmation of something I had once held in my mouth and chosen not to release. The cost of that choice did not announce itself loudly. It did not demand recognition. It simply existed, unfolding with a steady indifference to my regret. And as the full shape of what had been set in motion became impossible to ignore, I understood that silence does not protect you from consequence. It only ensures you experience it from the inside, with no language left to resist it. Time did not soften the memory. It reorganized it. What once felt like a moment became a place I returned to without choosing to. I could be anywhere, years removed, surrounded by different walls, different voices, and still feel myself standing there again, holding my breath, measuring the cost of sound. The details never faded the way I expected them to. They sharpened. The smallest parts endured with a clarity that felt intentional, as if memory were preserving them to prevent escape. The temperature of the room, the angle of the light, the exact instant my eyes dropped, not out of humility but out of surrender. I learned that guilt does not always arrive with accusation. Sometimes it arrives as companionship. It sits beside you quietly, patient, content to be acknowledged without ever being addressed. It does not shout. It does not argue. It waits. I tried at first to frame what happened in ways that allowed distance. I told myself that many voices were silent that day, not just mine, that systems are not undone by single words, that history is shaped by forces larger than hesitation. These thoughts sounded reasonable when spoken aloud. Inside, they dissolved, because the memory did not care about reason. It returned in fragments, uninvited, in pauses between sentences, in the brief silence after someone asked a question and waited for an answer that never came, in moments where a warning would have been inconvenient, uncomfortable, disruptive. I felt my body respond before my mind did, the same tightening, the same restraint. I realized that silence had trained me, not just in that moment, but afterward. It taught me how easily the voice can be conditioned to retreat, how quickly caution becomes instinct. I noticed myself hesitating even when the cost of speaking was negligible. The pattern had embedded itself too deeply to be confined to a single event. There were nights when I replayed the moment as if repetition might change it. I altered the timing, the phrasing, the tone. In these versions, I spoke calmly, reasonably, without challenge, without emotion. And in every version, the room still turned, still recalculated, still closed. I began to understand that what haunted me was not the fantasy of having been heard. It was the certainty that I never tried. That knowledge settled into me with a permanence that did not seek resolution. It did not demand forgiveness or absolution. It existed as fact, unmovable, untouched by explanation. I did not speak about it, not because I feared judgment, but because language felt insufficient. Words had failed once when they mattered most. To use them afterward felt like imitation, not repair. So the memory remained internal, sealed away, but never distant. It accompanied me through years that otherwise moved forward. Careers shifted, roles changed, new structures replaced old ones. Authority took different shapes. The context evolved. The silence did not. It stayed exactly as it was in that moment, complete, intact, irreversible. I came to understand something I had not known then, that silence does not end when the opportunity to speak passes. It continues. It stretches forward. It becomes part of how you occupy the world. And no matter how far I moved from that room, that decision, that pause before sound, the fear that closed my mouth did not leave with time. It learned my name.